critique the culture and tell them why some of the things that you're doing aren't working. So this is a quick clip from him at that conference talking about some of the reasons we need to understand culture.
What do I mean by a Christian high theory and apologetic? Well, by the way, I'm a little indebted to Leslie Newbigin on this, but let me talk to you about this. When you and I think of apologetics, we tend to think of evidence for the resurrection or reasons to trust the Bible, and that's right. But if you go to the early Christian apologists, and by that I mean people like Tertullian and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria and Augustine himself and Origen, if you read their apologetics, they did definitely do some evidence. They certainly talked about the resurrection as a evidence for the truth of Christianity, absolutely. But what they did was they critiqued their culture. See, I'm afraid a lot of our apologetics, in some ways, are granting too much to our culture, because our culture says, look, we are objective and rational. And if you Christians will come up to our high standards of objective rationality, we would be happy to give you a hearing. So we have the standards, and if you will come up to our standards, we would be happy to give you a hearing. That's not what the early Christians did. They critiqued the standards. They didn't come up to the standards of the pagan culture. They critiqued the very standards of the pagan culture. Or the way Leslie Newbigin says, before you explain the gospel to the culture, you need to explain and critique the culture with the gospel. You need to say to the culture, your standards don't work. You're not objective. You say you're objective. You're not rational. You say you're rational. Okay.
So as Keller explains there, we sort of run into this thing, and I think we'll run into more of this as we move into more of a post-Christian society, where we have to explain to people why their standards don't work, why their framework for how their life should look is ultimately going to let them down. And I think I would submit that understanding the news, understanding what's going on in current events is a window into what's happening in our culture, and ultimately gives us a better sense of how to sort of do this exchange. Keller talks a lot about understanding the culture and being immersed in it enough to be able to make that critique thoughtfully and effectively. And I think one of the ways that we do that is by working through current events and understanding the news, which has gotten to be a fairly difficult task. And hopefully some of what we learned tonight will be helpful in managing that. So to move on from there, just a brief look at how we operate at the Star Tribune. And this, I think, is a fairly customary way that newspapers would operate. I think you would find most newspapers and probably a lot of mainstream news organizations would operate under a similar framework to this. So my job, again, is I'm a beat reporter, which is the kind of the jargon that's used in journalism. A lot of these terms, I think, come from the cop world. A cop walks a beat. A reporter has a topic that they are assigned to cover in general at the Star Tribune, and mine is the Vikings. We have people that cover all the different teams in town. We have people that cover the state capitol. We have people that cover Minneapolis City Hall, education. We have people that review concerts, for the variety section, people that write about business. We have people that cover Target, General Mills, 3M, Best Buy, and all those different Fortune 500 companies we have in our area, US Bank. And we have people that cover a number of different things. And those people their job is to gather news, find out what's going on in their specific areas of influence, and write news stories about those things. Those stories are to be, as best as we can get there, objective. People in my job are not really allowed to write opinion. I'm not allowed to say, I think the Vikings should do this. My job, I look at it, is to tell you why I think they're going to do something or how it's going to happen. But it's not my job to say the Vikings need to fire Mike Zimmer or they need to trade Kirk Cousins or whatever it is, because my job is not to write opinion. We have certain people who are able to do that at the paper. Those are columnists that have individual columns in the paper. Sid Hartman is probably our most famous, just turned 100 years old in March. So running a couple times a week, believe it or not, with a little bit of help, but still mostly Sid's own thoughts in the paper. And then we also have an editorial board, which is independent of our newsroom. There is a physical wall between the newsroom and the editorial board in the Star Tribune's offices, and there's certainly metaphorical wall as well. People cannot cross from one to the other very much. And this is a lot of times when you hear the Star Tribune described as liberal or the New York Times, it has a lot to do with the positions the editorial board would take. It's endorsing Democratic candidates or espousing progressive viewpoints a lot of times, probably more so than they go the other way. So when you hear an organization described as having a political slant, it has a lot to do with that editorial board. When I submit a story, it goes on to editors from there that kind of they fact check things, make sure things are spelled right, make sure numbers are correct, and kind of the nuts and bolts of things. But part of their job, especially on larger stories, like the investigation we did a couple of years ago on rape cases being under investigated and not prosecuted sufficiently in Minnesota, that story goes through numerous editors to check it for thoroughness, clarity, fairness, balance, all of those things that we try to get to as best as we can. And in any human endeavor, we're going to make mistakes. And in journalism, they're very public when we do make them. But the process is designed to ferret out as many of those things as you can. So, and then as far as we go, as we move into the election season here, we are not allowed to support a political candidate, which kind of extends from some of the ethics we have in place in our newsroom, where we're not allowed to pay for coverage. We're not allowed to get paid or accept anything of value from a source in exchange for favorable coverage. And Pew Research has talked a lot about this, that most of the country believes that media members are paid by their sources to write certain things. At least in our world, that is not true. And there's a lot of diversity in what is known as the media in 2020. But at least in our world, you're not allowed to do that. And as we move into election season, we are told we cannot have a lawn sign. We cannot post on social media the candidates that we are publicly supporting. We can certainly go vote. But one of the things that happened this year was a change in Minnesota. Minnesota in its primary said, if you are going to vote in this, you have to identify yourself or register with one political party. So I didn't vote in the primary for that reason. I didn't want that to become public where somebody would say, oh, he voted this way. I don't trust him to be an objective reporter anymore. Our leadership said, you are allowed to go vote in this primary if you want to, but we will not be doing that. So make your own decision on your conscience. But that's some of the issue we ran into there. So that's a little bit of the tightrope that we try to walk as best we can at the Star Tribune. And I think most newspapers would probably do something fairly similar to that. We hear a lot about the media in this country as if it's some sort of monolithic thing. And this is just a little bit of a snapshot of what it looks like. It's actually fairly small. It's 88,000 employees right now, down from, I believe, 114,000 in 2008. So it is a lot smaller for, I think, reasons that are probably no big mystery to a lot of people. It's advertisements have moved largely online, and newspapers and media organizations in general have not done a great job of getting people to pay for their content as we move into a digital era. So you've seen a lot of layoffs, you've seen a lot of places closing, a lot of disruption in the industry in general. And when I say the industry, it's everything from local newspapers to Fox News to CNN to the New York Times to MSNBC to NPR to new websites to podcasts. There's a lot more diversity of thought in this industry than a lot of people, I think, would believe. And ultimately, it's not very big. You look at those numbers compared to the number of people that work at Amazon or Apple alone, and there's more people at one of those companies than there is in the entire media industry in the United States. The accusation that it is made up of cultural elites a lot of times, I think when you look at some of those numbers, that's a fair charge. The fact that 1 in 5 media members in this country lives in New York, DC, or LA does contribute, I think, to some of that cultural bubble that we see represented at times. And there's certainly good reasons for people to live in those places. There's a lot of news that happens in DC, New York, LA, and those are big cities. So there's going to be a lot of things going on there in general. But the idea that we don't do a great job of representing what's actually going on to the fullest of our ability, I think is a fair criticism of where we are, especially when you look at some of those numbers of the representation in the industry. It is a very white industry and largely made up of white men like me. So it's something that I think people are trying to work on and try to change. But when you see the industry fall short at times, I think, of representing culture and covering it in as complete a way as possible, I think that's one of the reasons we sometimes fall short in that regard. It is largely, at least in terms of polling how journalists vote individually, fairly moderate. It's 65% say they don't identify with either party, but it is noteworthy that people that do identify with one or the other are 4 times as likely to be Democrats as they are Republicans. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. It's a very college educated industry. It's people that live in cities. It's largely middle class jobs that in newsrooms that have been unionized for a lot of years. So there are a lot of things about it, I think, that tip people towards the Democratic Party individually, but that does not mean that organizations themselves should lean that way, at least in their news coverage. So it's always this balance of trying to figure out, how do I get my own personal biases out of a story and contribute to coverage that is as fair and balanced as possible. But that's more of an art than a science. And I think when you look at some of the things that come into it, the personal beliefs and the biases that people do bring into coverage, it is a challenge to work through those things. So that's a little bit of a shot of how the industry looks, and how we get our news. I think is changing quite a bit as well. And social media has had a big part of this. We'll see more of that a little bit later tonight in the survey that all of you took in terms of how much news we get from social media, but it is a lot. And it is a lot despite the fact that a lot of people in this country, and this is again from Pew Research, say that social media companies contribute to a worse mix of news than we would otherwise get, and they have too much control over what we see. So social media is such a big part of our lives that it gets harder to avoid that. But I think it would serve us well to understand what we are getting when we go do a Google News search, or we go on our Facebook news feed and have a news story pop up, or we have results to a search come up. Google, when you type in a search in Google, it gives you what you asked for. It's not somebody on the other end saying, here is all the news that I think you need to know, and here's the viewpoint that you may not have considered, but you need to encounter that. That generally isn't what you're getting when you go into Google. They're telling you, okay, you asked for this, here you go. So it's not as much probably getting your meat and potatoes as it is, hey, I want more of this thing that I like to eat. So that is some of how Google's influence on what we see tends to work. And we have a lot of people in our industry trying to figure that out. Search engine optimization is a term that gets talked about quite a bit in the journalism world, as most of us liberal arts grads try to figure out the thing that the tech people have already mastered. When I was at ESPN, we talked a lot about, here are the headlines you have to write, and here are the ways that you should write them to get them ranked highly in Google. So that effect on how we get our news is a big one. And Facebook has been just as big, if not bigger. There's been plenty of attention on the role that Facebook had in the 2016 election in terms of the sharing of misinformation and fake news stories. And they have had to try to figure this out as they go here. Mark Zuckerberg has appeared before Congress in 2018 and has had a lot of criticism about this. And he has consistently said, Facebook is not a media company. He said, we're a technology company. We are responsible for our content, but we are not a media company. Why would he try to draw that distinction? Here's why. If you are a media company, you are subject to certain regulations. If you're a broadcast media company, you're governed by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. If you are a news organization in print and you do something that would be considered libelous, if you slander somebody's reputation and show that there is malice behind your actions, it's a hard case to prove in court, but news organizations are accountable to those laws. So Facebook, I think, is probably trying to say, well, we want to have this part of our site where people come to it, but the accountability piece of it that comes into it is something they're, I think, still trying to figure out. And it's been interesting, even in the last couple of months, to see some of the changes that have gone on at that site as a result of some of this conversation. So as we talk about all of this stuff, and as we get into how we filter through news, understanding how bias works is a big topic. And I think it's one that we could spend hours on, and we're certainly not going to do that tonight. But just a quick overview of 3 of the forms of bias among many that can show up in news organizations, and then the ones that show up in the way that we consume news. Opinion statement presented as fact. I talked early about how certain people in newsrooms are not allowed to present opinion, or are at least discouraged from doing so, and certain people that are allowed to. But that line has gotten a lot blurrier. As I have spent more time on social media, I get asked more often what I think, what I believe the Vikings should do. I get asked on the radio about that. I get asked when I cover a game that everybody has already watched to tell you why something happened, how something happened. And the line between doing that and analyzing things and telling you what should happen gets a lot blurrier. So as we look at political coverage, I think you see that as well, and we'll get a better chance to see that a little bit later tonight. But that is certainly going on, and that line is getting harder to navigate. So it's I think worth understanding that there is some nuance there that we have to figure out. Bias by omission is another big one. It's not just the words that are used when a story is covered, it's what is not covered. What perspectives are missing from a story? How often are we looking at things beyond a white male lens of things? If that's the people that are covering a lot of these stories, how often are we missing a perspective on a big story? COVID-19 comes to my mind quite a bit, and I've texted with Benji about this a couple of times. The way that virus is affecting minority communities is profound, and I don't know that story is getting covered in the way that perhaps it should. Jamar Tisby is talking about this later this week in an event with Transform Minnesota that may or may not already be full. I'd certainly encourage people to check that out if they're interested in it. But some of the news coverage we don't get, I think sometimes, is due to this bias by omission. And then bias by placement is, we're gonna take a look at this just in a few minutes here, but the way that organizations lay things out and tell you what is important can reflect some bias. We're going to take a few minutes a little bit later on to look at different news websites and kind of look at the mix of stories that they have and kind of what they're telling you is important and what's not. And there certainly can be opinions and inclinations on the behalf of news organizations and journalists that come into how those things get played as well. So that's some of the bias in terms of how things come at us. But then there's also bias on our parts. We all have these things as human beings, and I think it's worth understanding those. Cognitive bias is just that we have a lot of information that comes at us on a daily basis. We have a lot of things to filter through, and our brain can't always process it all. So we resort a lot of times to familiar patterns, things that we already believe, things that have been familiar to us, especially when we're presented with something that may not be familiar to us. So we, as we're processing things, tend to lean on cognitive bias to some degree. Societal bias is simply just that we a lot of times are who we hang out with. Our friend groups tend to influence a lot of what we think, and research often shows that our friends generally are people that see the world in a very similar manner to the way that we do. And that becomes a bigger issue when now your friends or your family are part of the gatekeeper role that media has traditionally played in terms of how you get your news. When your friends are posting something on social media, or your family is, you're going to see it more often, both because those organizations know that those people are your friends and they're your family, but they also tend to think the same way. So you may spend more time looking at a particular article, and then that tips off the algorithms of social media companies saying, hey, Ben spent 45 seconds looking at this thing and he spent 10 looking at the other one. So he's telling us he likes this one more than the other, and let's give him more of that. So there's certainly bias in the algorithms that govern a lot of how we get our news via social media too. So a lot to wade through there, but I think being aware that that's going on is certainly a helpful piece of things. Where do we land? Had everybody take a survey this month on your news consumption habits, and probably a lot of the sites that we went through were confusing to some people. I think a lot of people maybe had not been through all of those in the past, but those are the 30 sites that Pew Research used in its most recent survey nationally of what people think of news organizations and the ones that they trust, the ones that they don't. So where do we land? We are largely politically moderate. About half of us listed ourselves that way, and then we have probably a quarter of people on either side that say they're conservative or they lean liberal. So we're fairly split down the middle, I think, in terms of numbers, at least in terms of the people that are represented in this year's off-road. And that is, I don't know how scientific of a measure that is, but it's somewhat worth considering. And I think it reflects somewhat of what Trike always says about hope, is that 50% of us are liberal, 50% of us are conservative, and 50% of us don't care. So pretty, I think, widely expected results there. But the thing I thought was really interesting is how much news we do consume. 2/3 of us said we check it once or more a day. And almost the same number said we're consuming more of it than we did 5 years ago. And I certainly would be in that group. I consume a lot of news as it is because of my job, but it's something that I think it's moving faster, and there's just more of it to deal with in terms of how fast the news cycle moves. So I find myself certainly in that 62.5%. I think I filled it out that way when I took the survey myself. So mentioned social media a little bit. We get a lot of news from there. Locally, about 2/3 of us get news from there. Nationally, it's about 3/4. So we're getting quite a bit of our news diet in a day from some of those places that I mentioned. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it is how the world is now. And it certainly is, exposes us, I think, at times to things that are new to us, but it's also a way that things can get handed to us that are pretty familiar and helps create some of those filter bubbles or echo chambers that you hear those terms thrown around. And that has a lot to do with how we get things presented to us. So certainly worth keeping that in mind. Our most trusted sources, I just picked three of our most and least trusted sources here. You can get a better sense of it if you look at the full survey results, which are, you can click the link down below and see the takeaways on each news outlet that I had people look through. But we think of NPR very highly, which is probably not a big surprise for our crowd. PBS and the New York Times both scored very high in terms of trust. Our least trusted Fox News is number one. Rush Limbaugh's radio show was number two, although it didn't seem like as many people had as great of a knowledge of that one as they perhaps did with Fox News. BuzzFeed was interesting because they have actually started hiring more journalists to do objective reporting, but I think most of us probably think of BuzzFeed and we think of clickbait. So that one kind of landed in probably a little bit of its own anomaly there, but you can take a look at your own time at some of those survey results if you're curious to see more of that. So it is interesting, I think, to look at the differences in where we get our news simply in the way that it affects the way that we see the world. This is again from Pew Research, and they talk about, they did this survey, I believe, in the spring, asking people in the early going of things how the president has handled COVID-19. And you look at average responder in the United States says 23% of those people approve of the way he had handled things, at least at that point. Polls are a snapshot of what we see at a given moment in time. But that's where it landed there. Fox News viewers say 63% of them say he's doing a good job. And then you go all the way down to MSNBC, NPR, New York Times, where it's almost nobody says that. So it gets interesting to look at this when it's that big of a gap, because I think most of us probably feel like on a lot of these things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. And when we have that large of a difference, when nearly 2/3 of us say, hey, everything's great, and on the other side of things, people may say, none of this is very good, it becomes hard to have a conversation based on objective facts. So I think as we try to navigate through this, it's worth understanding just how big of a difference there is on some of these things and how people see them, and ultimately how they make decisions on how they're going to respond to things like COVID-19 because of it. So what do we do during all of this? I think as we move into this role where we have a bigger effect on how we get news, and our friends and our family have a bigger effect on how we get news, we have to think like the people who have traditionally done that job. And I use the word assignment editor here. An assignment editor in a newsroom is typically the person that says, okay, we're covering this today. This is the important thing we're focusing on. Now that we are in a world where things are more fragmented and you can kind of pick and choose news sources as you like, you end up in that job for yourself. So we have to think about these things almost like journalists would, I think. And what do I mean by that is looking at when somebody's telling me something. The first rule of journalism, a lot of times, I had somebody tell me this just a few years ago, and pardon the language here for a minute, but when somebody tells you something, the first thing you should ask yourself, I had somebody tell me, is why is this son of a bitch trying to lie to me? So that is something that I have to go through my mind sometimes is, okay, is what I'm being told true, or do I need to check this out a little bit more? I think that's one of the things that as we get things presented to us, we have to do is, how can I trust this? Do I know that I can, or do I just sort of think that I can, or do I want it to be true? Where am I coming in with this, and what kind of a slant is it coming to me with? Have the facts been verified? Do you see those things represented in other places? Are there other sources corroborating the same thing that we see in a certain story? We talk about multiple attestation in the Bible. The fact that there are 3 gospels in a lot of cases that represent things exactly the same way is seen as a testament to its reliability. I think that's probably true as we get our news coverage as well. If things are covered the same way, or the facts are represented the same way, it becomes easier to trust and say that those things are reliable. And then the question of what incentive do people have to be accurate? If I make a mistake in my job, they print a correction in the paper, I hear about it from my editor, and if I do that a lot, I could either lose my job or have something where I get suspended or whatever it would happen to be. If you're somebody that's just throwing things out on social media, and I deal with so many of these people trying to spread fake Vikings rumors all the time on Twitter. I think I almost fell for one a couple of weeks ago, somebody trying to impersonate another reporter saying that the Vikings were trading for something or other, or I think they'd traded Anthony Harris or something like that. And I checked it out, sent a text to somebody with the Vikings saying, hey, is this true? And I was like, wait a minute, no, that's a fake account. I almost fell for that. So even I end up sometimes getting duped by those things. And those people, I think, probably are mostly just trying to have fun, but it can sow misinformation very quickly when those things happen. So be aware of that in terms of what incentive people have to be accurate, or what consequences they would face if they get something wrong. And then when you look at your news mix, what voices are missing? How much are you getting a taste of cultures other than your own, whether that be international news or news from population groups that are not like yours? How often are those voices coming into what you see, hear, read on a daily basis? And then how often are you getting news from the same places? I think we all have our favorites, and I think it certainly is valuable. The World Health Organization talked about this with COVID-19 in terms of an infodemic where misinformation spreads quickly. It certainly is valuable to have a few sources that we go to on a regular basis, that we trust those places and we think they're reliable, but we also can, I think, shelter ourselves off and put ourselves in silos in some ways if we do that too much. So some things to consider there, and we'll get a chance to practice this now. We're going to spend a few minutes in our cohorts looking at these 4 sites: Fox News, the New York Times, NPR, and Vox, which is a site a lot of people didn't say that they knew much about. They tend to do more what's called explanatory journalism, where they tell you, here's what's going on, here's why a trend that you might not know about is worth considering. We're going to take a look at those 4 sites, which are all, I would say, very different, and we're going to look at how they present things. So get in your cohorts, spend a few minutes browsing those, talk about observations you see in terms of the way they play certain stories, the things they emphasize, words they use, colors they use on their layout. All of those things say something about what the message is that they're trying to communicate. Just talk about some observations, and we'll get back together in a few minutes to share some larger observations from what we found on our cohorts. Comparisons, just feel free to unmute yourselves and shout out some observations if you have them.
Pretty easy to tell just based on some of the storylines, obviously, which way they're leaning before you even read the sub-story.
What jumped out specifically? Curious to hear more about that.
I'm glance at Vox here. Obama's commencement speech doubles as an indictment on Trump, or companies are giving workers bullshit rewards. So I probably don't need to read that article to know they're probably going to tell you how they're giving bullshit rewards. Pardon my language. Which,
yeah, Vox is an interesting one because it's a newer site that I think, my sense is that it's fairly easy to see that they lean left of center, and there's a really helpful media bias chart that has gotten some criticism from different outlets or different circles, I guess, but is somewhat useful too. And I can share that later on if people are interested in seeing that, kind of looking at this parabolic curve of where different outlets land. I think Vox probably would be on that side of things more than not, but if you just Google media bias chart, you can find it fairly easily too.
Yeah. It's probably more of an indictment to us, general public, now that how many of us do really read the rest of the story. You see the headline and it's your opinion. Skim on,
And the number of times that I've run into that on Twitter, where I'll write something and I have people, all the questions are, hey, what did you say about this? Like, guys, it's in the 4th paragraph. Sorry. So yeah, it happens a lot. What else? What other observations do we have?
I think one interesting thing is we talked briefly about the amount of space, I'll say categories of like what a news agency would put out. Some, it could be like opinion or sports or just like a news column. So like we talked about how the New York Times has like a third of the page or so dedicated to opinion.
They give a lot of space to the columnists.
Yeah, NPR doesn't even have opinion on the front page, or at least not clearly. So just like we thought that was interesting, like
Mhm.
how they chose to lay out in terms of space.
Yeah, and the New York Times does that a lot. They play their columnists right up front, and some of that may be an ego thing, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of people that work in this industry that have big egos, and just probably like anywhere else, but especially when you get higher up and you have a column in a place like that, there's probably some of those columnists that say, "Hey, I want people to read my stuff." So that may play into that to some degree, but yes, they do play their columnists very high, and that does. I think that line gets harder to figure out, as we talked about a little bit, in terms of what's opinion, what's not. The Washington Post, I actually think, does a fairly good job of this, where they will put a heading on a story and say, "This is analysis, this is opinion, this is a news story that relates to this subject." I think is that just a helpful thing to do, and some places do it better than others. So yeah, but I think that's a good observation.
One thing our group noted was that the NPR's headlines had sort of a more hopeful lean in how they sounded in the wording that they were choosing compared to Fox News seemed a lot more doom and gloom in the words that they chose. But then we also were pointing out our own biases as well and wondering how much our like preconceived notions of what we were going to find on Fox News's page or on NPR's page kind of influenced what stood out to us or what we were trying to put on them.
Yeah, yeah, that's all part of that mix, right? I mean, that we bring things to the table. News organizations bring things to the table as well. So, were there stories that popped up a lot? Were there themes we noticed in terms of stories that got covered a lot on one outlet or another?
We sort of had a discussion about what it's a little hard now with coronavirus all over the news,
Yeah.
but you pick up the newspaper or the your computer and you can hardly tell there's anything else going on in the world. And maybe that's because every part of what's going on is affected by the virus. But we were sort of commenting on some sources seem to have more reporting on other things than the virus than others. Like Vox seemed, I think Vox's whole page, as far as I could tell, on the front was just all coronavirus. NPR certainly at the top, the same way. Fox and the New York Times seem to have a little bit more.
Yeah.
Some other things. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I've felt that just in terms of being a sports reporter. It's like, what the heck are we supposed to cover? There's no sports. So it does touch in a lot of things. But yeah, you're right. There seem to be different approaches to that in terms of how much we have to cover it, and I think the tone with it too. Um, I think Lindsay, you mentioned that in terms of headlines, that certain sites are a little more hopeful than others. That has a big impact on how we experience things too. I've noticed a lot of that with the New York Times and the Washington Post, where the headlines are a lot of these, "Hey, here's this thing that you didn't know what's going on with COVID-19 and why it's a lot scarier than you really think it is." And I think some of it, I mean, certainly in New York, that's been ground zero of COVID-19. So some of that is going to influence it. But my suspicion is that reporters at some of those places sometimes are saying, "Hey, this is a really interesting story, and I have to tell it in as much depth as I can because I hope they're not thinking this, but I could see where it would happen because I know I've done it with myself. There could be an award on the other side of this for me if I covered this well enough, and it could be beneficial to my career to have this be as rich and dramatic as I can make it." And that shouldn't be part of the equation, but I think I've noticed it with some of those sites on a national level where some of those reporters maybe covering things a little more that way than, and take it for what it's worth. But I think at the Strib, we've done a fairly good job and we've got a story every day saying, "Hey, here's the number of new cases. Here are the number of people that are hospitalized. And here are the number of people that have left the hospital and come out of it." So, which is a detail I don't see played up everywhere. So, take that for what it's worth. But I do think there's some of those things that play into it as well. So We can talk more about these things at the end if people have other questions, but we'll move on now into the next kind of segment of the evening in terms of how we interact with government. So we'll spend more time here probably looking at scripture than in any other really point of the night, but we're going to start just by looking at what government is set up to do in the way that God ordains it as part of a created order. We see a lot of this in the New Testament. I think we looked at a little bit of this last month when Brian brought us a few of these same verses, but we see this theme that governments are instituted by God to uphold justice and punish evildoers. You see it in Romans, you see it in First Peter, you see it in a number of other places in practice in the Bible in terms of what government is there to do. It is meant to encourage human flourishing. It is meant to keep people from breaking the law, from doing things that are outside of the productive framework for human flourishing. It's meant to do those things primarily in the way that God sets it up, but the authority of it is not ultimate. And I think that's worth remembering, especially in this country, as we spend a lot of time talking about how this works. It is subject to God's authority. We see this in Daniel. This is actually the end of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has that he asks Daniel to interpret. He says, I don't know what this means. Can you tell me what it is? And I kind of look at this first and it's like, dude, they tell you right here what it means. It's that you are not the ultimate authority. It's the dream where a tree is growing too high and it gets chopped back down. And Daniel basically comes in later and says, yeah, it means what you basically just described, that God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and he gives them to whoever he wants. And that means that he has authority over you. It means that you have been installed in this spot, I should say, by his will, but it also means that he can take it away at whatever point he wants. So I think as we look at government and the ways that we interact with it, it's important to remember that it is not sovereign. God is. So how do we do this? There are four sort of themes I see, and I'm going to send you guys back into your cohorts pretty quickly to look at these things. Kaylin can give us a better sense of who's going to discuss what, but we see sort of four typical types of interaction. Submission as a general rule. I think we see this in Romans 13, we see it in First Peter, we see it when Jesus talks about render to Caesar what is Caesar's. That is a tax, as I think John Tyson talked about in the video that we watched this month. That is a tax that was helping Romans effectively oppress Jewish citizens in the Roman Empire. And Jesus said, you should still pay this tax. So submission, I think, is meant to be our general posture. We are supposed to honor government, pay taxes to it, and give it respect that it is due as part of God's created order. We are also supposed to work within it, at times working in pagan governments, as we see in the Old Testament, to advance God's purposes. We are called to resist it at times, especially when it conflicts with God's will. And that does not necessarily mean, oh, the governor still doesn't want me to meet with more than 10 people at a time, but I want to get my small group back together, and I think God wants me to do that. That's probably not what that means. The examples we see in the Bible are more along the lines of, you want me to stop speaking about God's goodness and who he is, I'm not going to do that. So we'll take a look at some of the examples that we see both in Daniel and in Acts as well with that. And we need to remember that we belong to a kingdom that is not of this world, and the power that we have available to us if we get such power in elected office, whether it's us as elected officials ourselves or the candidate that we like, that is not really worth all that much. And we see a couple of times where Jesus has opportunity to take it, and he says, no, that's not what I'm here to do. And whether it's in a situation where I have a chance to rise to power or I have a chance to try to maintain whatever status I have, I'm not interested in doing that. So we'll spend some time in our cohorts looking at those, and we'll split up basically into four different sections to each look at scripture here, and we'll come back together in a few minutes to share some observations, and we will move on from there. I assume, right? See nodding. Okay. First group, in terms of how we look at submission, any observations there? What jumped out to you guys as you read those scriptures?
I can chime in. I'm not even positive if we were assigned to this group, but this is what we did. So I can chime in briefly. I mean, I think we saw, exactly as this says, a general theme of God appointed government. He's sovereign over it. We as followers of God are called to submit and follow and come in line as a general matter. And also that submission has to mean more than just we submit when it fits our preferences or our likes. Like if submission is only real if it means there's some meaningful category of times when we really don't want to, but we're going to recognize that God has put government in place and it's not our preference, not what we would choose, but we're going to honor that God's sort of agent in a sense. And then I'd say the other thing we'd say is in that Mark passage, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God's what is God's. This implicitness that there are some things that are not Caesar's. There are some things that are due to God. So I'll leave it at that.
Anything else on those verses from, I mean, it can be from anybody. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with those. All right. Hearing none, what about the next group of verses there in terms of how we work with governments? We see a lot of examples of this, I guess, more in characters in the Bible than maybe specific direction. But what did we learn from Joseph, Esther, Nehemiah, Daniel through some of those verses there?
Talked about how a lot of those people were developing a rapport with the leaders that they were assigned to work with, and building trust, so that then when they did feel led by God toward different actions, that they had already established this relationship where they were trusted to fulfill them by the leaders.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you certainly, I think, see that in, I mean, Joseph, certainly you see it, Nehemiah, Daniel, I mean, yeah, Esther too. I mean, there's this understanding that you have to kind of, I don't want to use the phrase manage up because that sounds too business-like, but you have to build a relationship with somebody as a person, not just as a conduit to authority. And yeah, I certainly think we see that through those places. I think some of that just comes from viewing people as image bearers of God first, and their station in government probably second.
And we also, Jenny also mentioned in this breakout in talking about these verses that these are all examples of where the Lord extended or revealed his character through like favoring or extending like rescue to people. But there are also times of like, I don't know, like even like when the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and it still like was involved in like the larger story and the larger theme of like who he is as like rescuer to the Israelite people, but it also meant like destruction for others. So it was interesting too to think about how like the response of government systems isn't necessarily always in favor.
Yeah.
But it does, like, regardless of the outcome, like the Lord reveals who he is and who his like what his character is.
Yeah.
And that it isn't limited by like the governing systems.
Yeah.
Mercy.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's totally right on. Anything else on that one before we move on to the resistance, as it were? Star Wars reference there, I guess. Yeah, what do we see on the examples of people resisting government action? What stood out there?
there was a rather clear violation of I should say disagreement between what a government said to do and what what God said to do. And so, aware of the disagreement between the two, they chose what God said to do over what government said to do.
I guess the other thing that sticks out to me in those verses is there is a willingness to bear the consequences. It's not just, I'm going to resist, but it's in expectation that everything will work out fine for me. There's a posture of, I'm going to resist, and maybe God will deliver me from this. Maybe he will not, but I have to do what I'm going to do, and I trust that God will be for me, whether it's in this life or the next. That if I do what is right here, that needs to be the ultimate goal, not necessarily my safety and security here. So that I think when I read through this certainly sticks out quite a bit too. Anything else there? All right, lastly, those last couple of verses in John, the group that had those, what kind of observations came to mind? What kinds of things did you notice in the way Jesus handles himself in those cases?
Did that one get assigned?
Maybe not.
Well, I wanted to ask because that could be why. So was there a group that talked through these verses? It's okay if no one did. We just want to make sure. All right, Ben, could you share with
Cool.
us then?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Just John 6:15 is after Jesus has fed the 5,000 and people are sort of fired up about this. Like, hey, you just did this great sign. And this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And Jesus basically realizes they're trying to come in and make me king. He says, John says, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Kind of doesn't want to, I mean, he knows the hearts of what people are trying to do here. There's this theme of, okay, the Messiah is going to come in and overthrow the Roman government and put us in power and make everything right again. And he's like, no, that's not what I'm here to do. So if he had wanted to do that, certainly probably could have made that happen either by human authority or certainly by God's, but kind of pulls away from it, saying this is going to interfere with my ultimate mission, even if power is available to me. So I think it's interesting the way he reacts there. And then John 18 is where he's before Pilate, and Pilate basically says, aren't you the king of the Jews? And Jesus asked, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this to you about me? Pilate answers, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. My kingdom is not from the world. So kind of this approach here of, if I had wanted to stay in power, if I had wanted to fight for my own security, we would have brought it. Like, you would know if I wanted to, if I was not here of my own volition in some way, if I wanted to drop the hammer on you guys, I could do it. Basically, I think is what he's saying. but you need to understand that my kingdom is not of this world, so I'm not going to do that because my purpose is different than that. So yeah, in both of these cases, he has opportunities here to either take power or defend himself, and he says, yeah, that's not really what I'm here to do. So those are the things that jumped out to me on those. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a look at the way government works. And now we move to everybody's favorite part of the evening. How do politics work with all this? One thing we, I think, need to realize as we start into this is that government is ordained by God. Politics, not quite as much of a God-ordained thing. This is much more of a man-made element of our system, and certainly is a very popular, or a powerful one, I should say, not popular. But this is a big force of what we deal with, and this is something we have to navigate as believers as well. The founding fathers, when they set up the government, a lot of them were very suspicious of the role of political parties, not wanting this to turn into this fight between two factions or maybe three. We've had different setups at times in our country where it's not just been two parties, but we are very much a two-party state at this point, and it leads to some pretty big divisions. So if we look at this, Pew Research was, as you guys probably have figured out by now, a fairly consistent source for me on a lot of this stuff. They have a lot of great polling data on a number of different things in politics, how it relates to the church, how it relates to the media. So they did a survey earlier this year on where white evangelicals plan to vote this fall. And we see it, the numbers look very similar, I think, in a lot of ways to what was reported out of the 2016 election, where most white evangelicals say they plan to vote for Donald Trump in the fall. You see a little bit of a different approach in different denominations of Christianity, certainly among white believers, but then quite a bit of a different look if you go over to the one that really stuck out to me in the Christian circle was the Black Protestant Church. In larger numbers, or higher percentages, I guess, in some ways, than you see on the white evangelical support for Donald Trump, the Black church is saying very strongly, we're going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And there has been a traditional relationship between the Black church and the Democratic Party over the last probably 50, 60 years, just as there's been a relationship in a lot of ways between the white church and the Republican Party. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And you can probably date back with a large part of white evangelical society to, things like the moral majority in the early 1980s and Ronald Reagan. And that's kind of when the polling numbers switch, when you see white evangelicals saying they're going to be more likely to vote for Republican candidates. But the Democratic Party has had its own support from the Black church, probably dating back in a lot of ways to the civil rights movement. So the issue of, is every Christian a Republican, is a little more nuanced than I think we typically understand it to be. And I think it's worth considering that as we go into the fall, that not everybody who is a Christian is one thing or the other. And I think that it's worth trying to understand why that is, and approach this with some level of nuance as we go into another heated season. So where should we fit in politics? Kind of the $64,000 question for the evening. I think it's worth considering as we start this, that there's a difference between God's covenant with Israel and God's covenant through Christ with believers in the New Testament. God's covenant with Israel was nationalistic in the sense that he set up laws and rules for Israel to govern itself and how it should behave as a people. God does not do this in the new covenant as much. We do not have something that is known as a Christian nation. We don't have theocracies in really, probably in the modern sense. I suppose you could argue maybe that the Roman Empire has been that over time, but there's not this command from God to set up a nation of special people in Christianity. There are special people, there are believers in every nation who are called to interact with government in a way that furthers God's purposes and increases the rule and the government of Christ, but we don't see it play out the same way. So it's worth considering that. It's also worth considering, I think, that Christianity, in some cases where it did not have the favor of government, has had more success than at times where it has. We see a lot of this in the early church. They certainly would not, we looked at it a little bit in Acts 4, the growth of the early church happened in some ways in spite of the government. We had people saying, hey, make up your minds about what you want to do to us, but we're going to continue to preach the word. And we had certainly lots of early disciples and followers of Jesus paying for their devotion to Christ with their lives, whether it was being jailed, executed, beaten, you go on down the line. And those examples are well known to all of us who have studied scripture, so I don't need to belabor them too much here. But it's important to note that that was not a situation where laws were on the side of God's people. They thrived in spite of that. And you see that Brian talked a little bit last month about Justin the Apostate, the last Roman emperor before Constantine made Christianity the state religion. And Scott Sauls, who was a pastor with Tim Keller in New York and now is a pastor in Nashville, writes about this in a book called Befriend, where he talks about Christians that were attending to the poor and advancing the cause of Jesus in ways that flew in the face of all the persecution they were seeing. And there was kind of this amazement that this was happening. And then Constantine comes along and makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And Sauls says that is the point at which the church starts to decline, when it becomes part of the state, when it becomes a state of religion. He says when it became the state religion, the church slowly began its decline toward irrelevance. So worth considering that probably as well, in the sense that Christianity has not needed the blessing of government necessarily to thrive in the 2,000 or so years since Jesus walked the earth. We talked about it a little bit. Politics are not necessarily part of God's created order. Government is, politics are not as much of that. And as such, we have political parties that don't match probably on every issue with how we see things. We even saw this, I think, with how different Christians vote. There are different things that are important to different people. There are different issues in each party's platform that probably align with Christianity, with traditional Christian beliefs, and some that do not. Certainly, we know it with the issue of pro-life movements and the Republican Party. Certainly, that's an issue that is important to many Christians and historically has been a key issue for voters. The issue of caring for the poor, the issue of racial justice has been more associated, at least in modern times, with the Democratic Party. And certainly those are things we see God prize as well. So not quite a one-size-fits-all thing there. And I think we see our political parties doing more and more of this purity test thing, where it's one moves to the right, one moves to the left. And it's if you're not with us on everything, then there's not really a place for you. So we were talking about this on our cohort a little bit, just in the sense that we don't necessarily always feel like we fit. And that's probably going to be expected. And that's probably okay, because there's going to be a lot of things where we don't. And perhaps some things where if we fit too much, we should check ourselves a little bit. Tim Keller writes about this. He wrote an editorial for the New York Times before the midterm elections a couple of years ago, looking at a lot of this, and he says this: another reason that Christians these days cannot allow the church to be fully identified with any particular party is the problem of what the British ethicist James Mumford calls package deal ethics. Increasingly, political parties insist that you cannot work on one issue with them if you don't embrace all of their approved positions. This emphasis on package deals puts pressure on Christians in politics. For example, following both the Bible and the early church, Christians should be committed to racial justice and the poor, but also to the understanding that sex is only for marriage and for nurturing family. One of those views seems liberal and the other looks oppressively conservative. The historical Christian positions on social issues do not fit into contemporary political alignments. So how do we go about this overall as we see kind of this, we don't fit here, we don't fit there, but we have to work with this stuff because it's everywhere, and we need to advance the causes of God and the kingdom of God in our world as we try to redeem culture. How does all this play out? Fortunately, tonight, we have in our midst a Hope staff member who is also an elected official. You may not recognize her quite as much because she's not in a hoodie and a stocking cap there, but Natty Severson, school board chair of Columbia Heights, is here tonight to talk a little bit with us about what that has looked like in her life and what being a Christian and an elected official is like. So, Natty, are you there?
I am. I just turned my volume on.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. It's fun to be here with you and be at Off-Road. Sorry I couldn't make it in March. That was a big bummer. We had some fun stuff planned for y'all. We had a card game ready. It was pretty great. It's all still sitting on the floor of my office, I'm sure. It hasn't been touched. It's going to be nice and dusty by the time I get back to it. but it's cool to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your journey into elected office and what got you here and what made you want to do it?
Well, if you would have asked me, if you would have said, Natty, are you going to get in politics? I would have said no. But apparently it surprised no one other than me. So I don't know what that says about me or about my way of being. But that's funny. Not even my husband, I think, was surprised. Were you surprised when I was going to run for school board? No, just no. He said he knew I would be on the school board the first time I went to a PTA meeting. And so, it's been a trip. I'll try to keep this short. I don't want to bore you for too long, but I am willing to stay after this. I know you wrap up here in a little bit, but stay after and answer questions. Yeah. But it was just an interest in being involved in my community. I am not like a highly politically charged person in general. I would describe myself as a mixed ticket voter. So you're not going to get me to say really that I support either party. I'm really not deep in the weeds politically, which is interesting. The draw of a school board is it's supposed to be a nonpartisan election, and so it's discouraged in a lot of areas, especially communities like Columbia Heights that are smaller, and people actually, for a lot of reasons, know the people they're voting for personally, or at least by word of mouth. That here it wouldn't play if you got supported by a political party. I know that's very different in like Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools, very different. And so for me, it was really just a desire to make a difference in my community. Jared and I have been living in Columbia Heights now for 19 years, and it's been just a big part of our life to be really involved. We moved here because we wanted our kids to be in a diverse community. And they're getting that in their community, and we want to be a part of kids' lives. My husband is a middle school teacher. We both have coached every single youth sport, every single one. Maybe we haven't, like bowling club. We haven't done that yet. And I know we will, because now our kids are all in high school. They're in 9th, 10th, and 12th grade. So we've got a bunch of kids in high school and a graduating senior, born the day after 9/11 and graduates to a pandemic. So he's had quite the run.
Quite a book,
yeah, those are his bookends right now. And so, we just really want to be a part of our community and dig in. And so as we had these opportunities, and my son's kindergarten teacher suggested I be a part of the PTA. And when I got there were 4 people, and I thought, oh, this is a nightmare. They don't know what they're doing, and got involved with that. And of course, with all the zeal of Natty Severson, if you know me, really constructed a PTA that was pretty epic. It's pretty good PTA. So
what is an epic? How would you define an epic PTA?
You bring in a ton of money and have a lot of fun events.
Okay.
And your volunteers are happy to do it. If you can pull that off, man. God was pretty good. He used a lot of my natural giftings, the same ones you probably see at play at Hope, in that atmosphere. It's cool to be involved in that sort of thing. And then when the school board went through some turmoil here in Heights, and I just thought enough's enough. I want to reasonable voices speaking on behalf of the kids. And so I ran for school board.
Yeah. You kind of talk about it. It's not a partisan thing. Have you found that people sort of try to put you in a box one way or the other? Because people know you work at Hope. They know that you're a Christian. Do people sort of say, do they expect you to land on one side or the other, whether it's don't get political or you need to take certain stances because you're this or that? Do you find that happens much?
Oh my gosh, it's such an interesting thing. I work at a church, so it's not like I'm just like playing this like super undercover Christian. Yeah. And so people, they want to know a little bit about Hope, because I think I was telling Ben and I were talking earlier this week. We talked for quite a while, and I was saying I have an interesting kind of thing because I don't really read like Christian. I think people meet me and they don't like just, oh, there's a conservative Christian for you. And so I don't really read that way. So I think at first people are more surprised I work at a church, not because they have necessarily preconceived notions about me, but because they have, like, they're like, okay, because I, probably I don't tell them what to do, or criticize them when they swear or whatever, like whatever they think a Christian's going to do.
Yeah.
But by the time I gain enough notoriety to be on school board, people know I work at Hope. And now with Hope for 6 weeks in a Columbia Heights school building, it became a little, I was out there. That was the church I worked at, and I was now meeting in a school building, which no one ironically seemed to have issues with, because I wasn't doing any negotiations with the school district. Yep. Having said that, the original question was, it's not partisan. Do people make it partisan? Of course. If I took a bell curve of kind of like, like here's the bell curve, right? I think, most people are kind of that middle. They are not so interested in even what's happening. They just kind of, they go through an election and they trust their elected official in this capacity to do their job, and they sort of stay out of it. But I think it's the people who are highly political charged on both sides and equally charged, who really highly vilify each other, that want to remind me it's not a partisan thing, but want me to do everything according to their partisan standing. Hold on a second. My kids are in the kitchen now. Suddenly, they haven't been in the kitchen in forever, and now they're deciding to make mac and cheese, and one of them shaking a box while the other one whistles. So hashtag quarantine, baby. Can you hear them?
No, a little bit, not too much.
No, they're doing it on purpose now.
Oh.
It's probably
because of me. I mean, it's probably not...
they really have a Ben Gessling thing, because Ben wins trivia during Hope Game Night every Monday night. Tune in. And so they are really
night losing streak, though.
They're eager to beat Ben at something. And so they want to make things partisan, but they want you to remind you that it's not. And then they tell you how to be partisan, essentially, and if you've lived up to their expectations. But I think they have a little head shaking confusion about why the most confused people are the Christians, I would say predominantly white evangelical Christians who live in Heights, not Hope people, because now there's a ton of them up here, but kind of the other camps, maybe a little more traditional in their ways of thinking, are very confused by me. I present to them a confusing dichotomy. They can't understand why I would be pro-state giving public schools more money, which is a traditionally Democratic stance. And because it's associated with the Democratic Party, I think to the tune of people having questioned my actual faith because of the way I would want the state government or the federal government to spend money. So it gets dicey. I mean, people are, when politics becomes your God, it's, you'll say crazy things. And that's for Christians. They make great idols out of politics. On both sides of the aisle, I would suppose. I've gotten the most blowback, though, from other Christians, I think, who are very conservative. So that's been the most interesting part of this whole process. Yeah.
So how do you handle that? What's been your response to that?
Unless we're one-on-one, sitting somewhere, and there's not an audience, I just don't respond.
Sure.
It's not worth getting in a turf war or a spitting match, so to speak, on social media. I wouldn't respond. I would untag myself when I get tagged. I get tagged as school board member Natty a lot. I untag myself most often. I answer the person's question if there's an actual question related. If they want to antagonize me or make me want to take get a soundbite bait out of it, like they want to grab my little soundbite out of there and then run with it, I just don't respond to it. Or I'll write something like, thank you. You can email me on my school board email address. Click, untag as fast as I can. And then hope they engage me there. And every time I've offered that, nobody has.
Yeah.
So no one's done that. So
yeah, sometimes.
They just want to clickbait for other people, or they want to make a point of something. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Crazy Vikings readers do some of those same things. So not an unfamiliar exchange there, but when you kind of deal with that process of people trying to put expectations on you or tag you in things or whatever, and you and I talked about this a little bit this week, even about you being at football games and they expect you to dress a certain way.
Oh, yeah.
What is that like? I mean, in terms of getting to a point where you're okay with that, or just being able to deal with it on a personal level?
Yeah, I remind people that I'm the same person that I was. I don't have high or political aspirations. So I think if you're in the kind of Minneapolis St. Paul public schools, often people get on those boards because they're looking, and there's city councils for those bigger cities because they're looking to use it as a launching pad for a political career. That's not me. I'm not firmly entrenched in one political party enough to do well in politics. That's just the truth of the matter. And so when people try to put me in a box, it's funny. I was telling Ben that, as soon as I got elected to school board, some people who, I consider them acquaintance friends in our community, sat me down individually and like told me that because now I was on the school board, I was going to have to dress better at football games. I'm like, no. One, it's cold. Do you want me to wear like a power suit to my son's football games? And like my son said, yes, please. It's not the football player, it's the other one. I would appreciate it. It's not open forum for discussion right now, buddy. And so it's just like, it's just these odd things. Like somehow I changed my status as a human being. I was telling Ben though, you saw my picture there. When I go to board meetings, I wear board appropriate clothing because it is a sign of respect for the office, because people did elect me, whatever, 7,000 people or whatever. That's how many votes I think I got. Maybe it wasn't even that many. I don't know. Our town's only got like 20,000 voters or something like that. And most people, don't care about school board elections. So, like as if that was going to somehow change me. And it didn't, thankfully. It's made me a lot more leery of people. It's made me a lot more leery of, I see that record button and I can't help but be cognizant of it.
Yeah.
There are things I won't say right now in this meeting simply because that record button's blinking. Mm-hmm. So if Q&A, if we unclick the record button, I'd be more willing to talk to you about things. So, and it's just how it's got to be. Yeah. Because there's never a moment where I can't say I'm not being a school board member, despite a hoodie and a stocking hat. I'm still a school board member. It's the same way that I can't unsay that I'm a Christian or I work at Hope. Oh, it doesn't matter that I'm doing X, Y, Z things because I'm not on the clock at Hope. Can you imagine me saying that? That'd be terrible, right? And so that same thing holds true because there's a higher level of scrutiny when you're in certain lines of work. And I would say this is one where now all of a sudden everybody wants to, and if somebody doesn't agree with the way you do things, they want to catch you red-handed. So it's interesting now that maybe some of my more conservative Christian friends disagree with some of my theories about public education. So they're the ones who they're not my friends. They're just people in the community. I call them friends because hopefully we're in eternity together. We will really understand each other. And none of this will matter, right? But it can be some of the harshest people out there, which is, I think that just feels really hurtful. I have to talk a lot of those things through with my husband and just let it go, lay it at the foot of the cross and say, I don't understand this. I don't understand why people behave this way. So
what was the process like of running a campaign that whole thing just seems kind of wild to me. What was that like?
You'd think I'd be awesome at self-aggrandizing. I'm just not very good at it. I love to talk. Yeah. And so I just I'm not very good. I'm a terrible politician, apparently, says my friends. I'm way too honest. I say what I think far too much. I don't mitigate it. People will make jokes about you're not going to get reelected with that. I'm like, fine, don't reelect me. Somebody else can do it. And so I'm yet to determine if I'm going to run again. I have to decide by June. So it's coming up. That's when the window is to apply their 4-year terms. But I wasn't going to, and then this pandemic happened. And I feel like now there's some amount of need to have continuity on the board. So this might have changed it for me. So we'll see. But if I do, I'm not going to make a big deal out of running. Yeah. I'm going to try to run on name recognition and the fact that I've been doing a good job and hope that it's enough. But it was weird to make a pamphlet promoting myself. Yeah. It's just really weird. Emily Musso said she's going to do it all for me this time. So she's going to run my campaign from Denver. So you're going to make my pamphlets for me?
It's that was enough for once. I feel like I'm sitting here now thinking That would be a sweet gig. Could I write the campaign pandemic, like the new way to run? I don't know how, but I
Yeah,
can make
you're
it
gonna have
up.
to teach me. Yeah, do it. You're on it. Can you do it?
Will you pay me?
Sure. I'll do Amazon gift card. I have to report that if I pay you, because you have to follow all the rules. There's money caps and reporting who gives you money, but my donors could pay you a clean Amazon gift card, yes.
Well,
So
Great.
you're recruiting campaign staff here. You're hinting at it. Do you want to make an announcement right here on LDI Off-Road that you're declaring for re-election this year?
spoken only as a reporter can. Right there, Ben. I guess we're both showing our colors, right?
Yeah, you're dodging my. I'm asking you a question. And
Yeah,
you're dodging it. Yeah,
yeah.
very
Spoken
typical.
only as a rep only. Yeah, I'm great at dodging questions. You're great at asking them. I guess we're in the right lines of work.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you're nicer to me than Mike Zimmer is when he dodges my questions, so that works out. We'll take it.
I have a better temper than Zimmer, I think.
Well,
So.
yeah, it's probably part of that job. It requires some of that too.
Yeah. Bad-tempered school board members don't really fly, but it seems to happen a lot. So.
Awesome.
My board is great right now. My board is great right now, though. So.
Yeah.
Truthfully, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Natty, thanks for sharing some of your perspective, and it's fun to hear some of the things that you're doing outside of Hope and how this intersects with some of what we're talking about tonight. I think Natty's going to hang out for the rest of our time. So if people have questions, I will try to breeze through this last part here so we can get to those. So Natty, thanks so much for helping us out.
Yep.
All right, I will share my screen again. So we'll get back to the last section of things here tonight. Can you guys see that okay? So yes. Thumbs up, anybody? Can we see that? Cool. All right. Last kind of set of things tonight. How do we engage with current events? How do we look at what is coming in the next few months here and what we probably see every day, really? I mean, COVID has gotten probably divisive enough. It's gotten politicized in a lot of ways, as everything seems to do. So how do we navigate this as Christians? I have like 9 thoughts on this, and then we will close for the night and open it up for questions if you guys have them. So first thing, we need to spend as much time in Scripture as we do in the news. And I say this as much for myself as anybody else. I am certainly part of that 62% that spends more time reading the news than I did 5 years ago. Do I spend more time in Scripture than I did 5 years ago? I think so. I don't know that I could say it as decisively as I could with news. So as we go through this, I think looking at Scripture as a counterbalance to what we see in current events does a few things. Number one, it helps us see people as image bearers of God, not just commodities or people that disagree with me on things. Number two, I think it helps us have a broader lens for what's going on. We tend to look at what's happening right now and we say, how is this going to affect us? Are we all going to be okay? We don't see the end of something like COVID, or we don't see the end to poverty or the end to Black men getting shot by whether it's vigilantes or police, whatever the issue happens to be that we're stuck in the middle of. We don't see the end of it. But looking at Scripture tells us that God is sovereign over all of it. It tells us that God does not change and that God's plan and his timing is perfect even when we don't necessarily see it. So I think if we can spend more time there than we do with the news, it's just probably a better way to approach our worldview. John Dickerson talked about this in the story that I had everybody read in terms of how we should process news. Spend more time here than you do in the news, and it just probably helps you out. And also, I think the last thing that I see with this is Trike talked a lot about opportunity in the midst of COVID. I think he said that publicly, and in some of my conversations with him preparing for this, he said that as well. And my 8-year-old Lydia said that the other night when we were talking about all of this. She said, what if God is using COVID to advance the gospel or introduce people to him? And it's like, man, my 8-year-old gets that. I think the rest of us probably should too. Wisdom from the mouths of babes there or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot I think to be gained from balancing out what we take in. Number two, we need to understand the issues of our time with thoughtfulness, nuance, and a regard for truth. And by truth, I mean both biblical truth and factual truth. I think God is for truth. I think he is for letting your yes be yes and letting your no be no. If something comes out of your mouth, it should be factual. We should not give false witness in anything that we do. So the thing I think that grieves me a lot when I see where we're at is this idea that objective fact cannot be a common ground anymore. That seems to be sort of a new phenomenon, and I think we as Christians have a responsibility to, as much as we can, try to get to a point where we are speaking in truth and trying to get to the best metric of that we possibly can. But we also need to understand that there are people behind these issues, and there are people with a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different passions about them. So as we go through these, we need to approach it with some level of thoughtfulness, and also just the ability to discuss these things on a sophisticated, nuanced level. Number 3, we need to season our conversations with love for our neighbor and hope of the coming kingdom. The people that disagree with us on Facebook, or the people that vote differently than we do, or are campaigning for issues that we may not agree with, are image bearers of God, and we need to treat them as such, even if we don't agree. And I think we also need to look at these things as temporary issues. We should navigate all of this in a way that points toward a kingdom that does not have imperfections, that will not have systems that are needed to fix things, because God will have wiped away all of the negatives, all of the things in our world that are imperfect, and will ultimately bring back the way things are supposed to be. So as we look at these issues, we need to do so with hope that we are not necessarily living in this state for eternity, because we believe that we are not. Number 4 is ripped off shamelessly from Elise Holmes, who did a very good Ed Hour this fall on the gospel and politics. Certainly we recommend checking that out or connecting with her. She works for the Minnesota Department of Health, so probably has a lot going on right now, but certainly worth picking her brain on a lot of the things that she has seen and heard and experienced as well. A couple of her rules in that session were always assume the best in others and listen to understand. And I think a lot of times when we go on social media, we maybe listen to what somebody's saying, but we're typically readying our next point to try to come back and hit the serve back over the net and put the ball back in their court, or dunk on somebody, whatever metaphor you want to use. I think the last episode of The Last Dance is on tonight, so we'll go with dunk on somebody. But we should not be listening that way. We should be, instead of, here's what I think in response to what you think, maybe start with, can you tell me a little bit more about why that's so important to you? I want to understand your heart on that issue and why it matters to you. So listening to understand rather than listening to just make a point in response, I think is a good place to start from. And we need to assume that people are not evil. They're not monsters. They're not completely out of their minds if they disagree with us. They just see things differently, and that's an okay thing. Number 5, I think we need to retain that sound theology. There's a lot of temptation, I think, to contextualize theology and scriptural truth in this day and age. We need to contextualize the gospel in a way that people hear it, but I don't think that means diluting what scripture says. I think we need to fit our politics inside of our theology rather than the other way around. Wesley Hill talks about this in terms of sexuality. He is a celibate gay Christian, I think is how he would describe himself. And he says, my sexuality fits inside of my conception of God and my identity as a Christian. It is not that my Christianity fits inside of my same-sex attraction. One is bigger than the other, and I think that needs to be true here as well. Number 6 is also stolen from Elise largely. She talks a lot about our differences sometimes aren't as big as we think they are. They're not necessarily ideological differences. They are differences of practice. We probably all believe that caring for the poor and fighting poverty is an important issue, but we have different ideas about how to do that, whether it's government programs subsidizing income. You hear a lot about universal basic income in this election cycle, and just the idea of welfare in general, versus the idea that maybe we subsidize businesses or give tax breaks in a way that allows them to hire more people and let the market do its thing that way. So there are differences of opinion on that, but they are not always, I like poor people and I want to help poor people and you don't. It's not often that we are that far apart. We're probably closer and we argue more on the details of things. So I think if we bring our arguments and our discussions in that filter, I guess that's probably going to leave us in a better spot a lot of times. 3 more, we should get involved locally. We argue a lot on Facebook. We argue a lot on Twitter, Instagram, things that younger people use that don't show their age as much as I do by keep referring to Facebook. I'm 37, so I'm like a year older than Mark Zuckerberg, so that's kind of the thing I have grown up with mostly. But wherever we are, I think we spend a lot of time arguing on social media about issues. Those issues tend to become national ones. They tend to get more oxygen in the media ecosystem. The ability we have to get involved, however, is probably going to be more impactful locally. And I think Natty talked about that in some ways that are not necessarily where you just have to go say, I'm gonna run for office. It's a matter of getting to know people in your community, figuring out ways that you can help. And if you see a need, jump in. There's lots of places to do that at Hope. There's great ministries through the Redemption of the City that align with a number of different issues that you might be passionate about. If it's urban education, Hope Academy is a great place to be involved. I've done work there for the last few years as a volunteer, and it's one of the most rewarding things I do in my life. And I've learned a ton about the way God works in our city through the kids there, whether it's there or whether it's someplace like Urban Homeworks, trying to help people get on their feet and have a stable housing situation, community emergency services, Angel Tree, what else am I trying to think of? Somebody else give me a couple more of them here.
Source is a big one.
Yeah, fighting sex trafficking.
Yep.
Urban Homeworks, Urban Ventures.
Yep. Yeah, lots of different places to get involved, whether the issues are on one side of the aisle politically or another. We care about all of those things because we believe God does as well. So there are places to get involved locally, whether it's something like Natty's doing. Focus your energy there probably more so than you do nationally. I think that is probably a better use of our times, a lot of time, than just arguing about it on Facebook. And of course, that does mean that you should understand what's going on locally. So if anybody needs to see me again for that Star Tribune link to subscribe, let me know. I'd be happy to get that to you. Number 8, we need to realize that justice ultimately belongs to God. I think a lot of our passion about politics is a desire to see justice done, and we have different ideas of what that looks like. But we can move things incrementally towards justice, but ultimately God has the final say, and God is the one who will make everything right. So we have to understand that God is for justice. God loves justice. His word says that, but he is the one with authority to bring that to consummation completely. So as we work toward having things improve, we need to understand that it is not ultimately our place to make those things completely right. And we need to understand that the issue behind all of this is not necessarily broken systems. I mean, they are broken, but the issue that runs underneath all of it is sin. We live with broken systems because we are broken people that live in a fallen world. And as we try to redeem creation, we need to understand that we are not going to be able to do it completely. Nathan Vanderlaan said something in a book club that I was involved with about a year or so ago. We were talking about the issues of racial justice in the church and reconciliation. And Nathan said, if racism is solved, imagine that being the case for a second. If that happens, it would be the first sin in human history that has ever been fully eradicated. So, and he says this as an African-American male who very much wants to see justice brought about and things go back to the way God viewed them in the beginning when he said, let us make man in our image. And that means all different skin tones and different groups of people and different nations. That said, he knows, and I think it's worth remembering, that there is always going to be elements of sin in our systems because there's always going to be elements of sin in us until Jesus comes back and makes everything right. So we need to understand that, and I think we need to approach all of it with that lens. But I would close with this, and it's something that I just realized today as we were watching the latest episode of Some Good News, that John Krasinski show that has been going on during the COVID pandemic, where he's kind of just doing these 15-minute YouTube things to remind people that there's still good things happening in the world. And this thing has been a big hit, and he gets all these stars on there. So there's things that become big hits on social media because of that. But I think it's also become a hit because people are longing for something to give them hope. They want stories and information that help them point toward the sense that things are moving towards something better. And what a great reminder of the idea. I think there's an element of common grace in that to tell us that the desire for hope in human beings is ultimately pointing towards a desire that only God can fill. So as we deal with current events, as we deal with politics in this season, may we be people that point towards that hope and engage all of this stuff in the view that God is just, but God is ultimately the one that can satisfy all of these things that we long for as we engage with these issues. So that's all I've got. Questions from me or Natty, depending on how much, we got a few minutes here. So
Can I just piggyback on what you said, Ben? I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
those points were great. Can you go back to your list by chance?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned is how do you respond to people? And what I didn't get to is when I am able to talk to people one-on-one, I said if it's not one-on-one, I don't really respond. If it is one-on-one, I would say this is an opportunity we have to really show people that the gospel changes us from the inside out. This ability to just have civil disagreement with people, and not vilify. I think you had that on there somewhere, right? By assuming that the best in others and listening to understand. And when I was talking to Ben, I said, it's rare. It's like a couple of times, like out of the hundreds of people I've talked to personally about school board matters, that I really think, wow, something's really off about this person. Like it's a mental health issue or something's going on. Even though we don't agree with the mode, it's oftentimes, once we start looking at it, one of the analogies we use at Hope often is it's the analogy of an iceberg. You can only see the top 10%, right? And that's kind of the 10% we tend to get hung up on. And that's kind of the form something takes. Like, how are we going to deal with this? What event are we going to do? What's that fundraiser going to look like? What curriculum are you going to use? Depending on what you're in. But that 90% that's underneath it, I hope we would talk about theology, but most often people I'm talking to here in Columbia Heights don't have it. Like they're not resting anything in theology. But I talk them back to our common values and principles. Like we value what's best for our kids. We value our community. So I try to bring it back to values and remind people that we're that, because they typically, if they're coming to me hot about something, they've made me the villain.
Yeah.
Even though we are friends in normal life, people can turn on a dime. It's incredible. Politics, and especially politics revolving around their children, gets people amped up like no other. And so me giving them the benefit of the doubt, but not being like reckless with what I say, obviously, but assuming they're not coming from a place of bad intentions. And so understanding our differences are sometimes over matters of practice, not ideology, I think is that big. It's that iceberg thing. How can I talk them back from the form and say, this is just a form we've decided on, guys. You can imagine how parents of seniors right now feel about what form graduation takes. And whatever form we pick, somebody's going to accuse us of either not caring enough about public health or not caring about kids. And so whatever form this takes, every school district is going to get beat on the head, right? So I have to remind them that just because I don't do these things doesn't mean I don't love their kids. Or just because I do that thing doesn't mean I don't appreciate and take seriously this epidemic. Does that make sense? And so I thought those are really good things, but I just want to throw out there, if we can focus on the things underneath the form, sometimes we can get past more and see where we agree.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, and note that politics, more than anything, I think is just will expose your idols very quickly. You can see exactly what people worship when it comes to politics, and you can see that amongst Christians too. When I'm inwardly so annoyed by somebody saying something, I'm probably worshiping the idol of me and my reputation. Or when I'm so miffed that the state government can't raise education spending, I'm trying to make public education the savior of all children rather than Jesus. Like it's really easy to make idol factories.
Yeah, definitely.
So sorry, I had to get my 2 cents there.
No, you're good. That's great.
Right.
Take a couple of these questions here. I think we have just a couple minutes, but Emily asks.
Can I ask one, Ben?
Go ahead.
So this ties to the very beginning of your talk. With all the time, with all the spare time we have, how do we figure out what are good sources of news to consume and what we should be skeptical of? And that's a serious question. I mean, you talked about like, do they do fact checking? Well, is there corroboration? But none of us are sitting around like with an extra half hour to spend in the morning to say, well, should I believe this story or not? So what kind of advice do you have for us as as believers, trying to be faithful and yet recognizing limited time.
I would tend to say, and consider the source here, but I tend to feel like news organizations that have been around for a long time are going to have better practices established of how they want to do things in that regard. I know, Brian, you asked a question at the beginning about fact checking and how this process works, probably at TV stations as well. And I think we have more people at the Star Tribune to do it, but they're legacy media organizations, as much as they kind of get a bad rap for being outdated or whatever, there is more in place there, I think. One thing I guess I go back to sometimes, I know in the Star Tribune's case, and I think I mentioned at the beginning, our code of ethics and the way that we cover certain stories, the way that we won't name victims of certain crimes, the way that we won't name perpetrators of certain crimes if they're under a certain age, all of that stuff is transparent and available to people as they try to figure out should they trust this source or not. I do think that says something when an organization is willing to do that. Say, here's the rules we play by, and if we violate them, call us on it, because there is that invitation to do that. So I tend to think that's a valuable thing. I probably land more on a lot of the mainstream sources than others might, just because both that's the kind of the world I'm raised in, and I also know the fact-checking processes that go into those things, and I know we make mistakes, but I think just that general idea of, is there a well-established track record of getting it right and owning up to it, I think when you don't get it right is also just as important. And I can point out a couple other resources in terms of places that grade different outlets on these things that you can basically plug in any outlet you want, and they'll give you a sense of how they've done on accuracy and where they lean, where their editorial board leans politically, that sort of thing. I'm happy to pass that along as that's useful to people. So grab a couple, well, maybe just one or two more here. Benji asked this early on, can you comment on where/how minorities consume news, online versus TV? Media coverage, as you mentioned, has a layer of bias. How are communities of color navigating this? I don't have a complete answer to this question. There are certainly outlets, I know in the Twin Cities and certainly nationally, that are meant to report news that affects a certain audience, whether there's African-American newspapers in the Twin Cities, Hispanic newspapers in the Twin Cities as well. A lot of communities have those things, but the large mainstream outlets probably, as we talked about, I think fail in that regard. So I don't have a great answer to what the overall trend has been, because I don't know if there's been polling that, at least that I've seen, that answers that with a ton of specificity. But I think it's a valid question. It's one I want to look into a little more than you brought it up. And I think it's something that's worth considering just as we try to figure out where might the gaps be in the news we take in and the news that gets put in front of us. Do we see Black faces? In what manner do we see them? Do we see brown faces? Is it always in the context of a crime, or is it things that people are doing that are positive? That's been a common criticism of the media for quite a long time in terms of how we portray minority groups. That's usually when they're doing something wrong, and that reinforces stereotypes. So I think it's important to figure that out, and I definitely want to look into that issue a little more and report back as we can do so. Kaylin, do you want me to wrap this up?
You can take one more.
Okay. Alicia asked, do you know / will we get to hear how this compares to elections past historically and in general? I think you mean in terms of how polling works. And I have some resources on that. I didn't include those for time, but there's Pew Research has a great trove of information on this. And there's a nice look there at how young evangelicals have voted over time. And you can kind of see where the shift happens as well. So generally, I think that the shift in terms of the white evangelicals moving towards the Republican Party, you kind of put 1980 presidential election as a watershed moment for that. That's kind of when the Reagan administration started to court Christians and with policies and certain language they used. And if you look at it since then, Republican presidents before Trump since that point have been Reagan's former vice president and Reagan's former vice president's son. So that thread has run through a lot of the Republican Party since then. But yeah, Pew Research would have a lot of polling on that, and I think the Barna Group also would. They've had quite a bit of polling on how Christians are viewed. That's one thing I noticed early on too, that the U.S. adult population views Christians largely as politically and religiously conservative above anything else. So both of those places have quite a bit of data on that. One more, because I am a reporter that always likes to try to squeeze in one more question, so I will answer one more. Adam asks, what do you think about advertising as a means of funding reliable news? Is it good that it allows for more free information? Does it skew news to focus on what people will click on and spend the most time viewing? That is a great question, and it's one that affects a lot of how my industry is working right now. The advertising market has collapsed because businesses are closed, so they figure there's no reason to advertise. So you see newspapers and media organizations around the country that are either laying people off, furloughs, closing down. We've seen that happen in a lot of places in Minnesota with smaller newspapers as well. So is advertising good and that allows more free information? Yes. Advertising, however, in the modern day and age does not pay the bills. We've seen this happen as ads have moved from classifieds and local advertisements in bigger media outlets in our local communities to Craigslist, and then probably on to Google and Facebook from there. They just do a better job of it because they have so much information on people that they are able to target ads more effectively, and people say, I can get more bang for my buck there. So advertising has shifted away from the mainstream media in a lot of ways, and that has been probably the biggest thing that has led to the reductions in the number of bodies in newsrooms that you see. So my advice, and this is going to be a little bit of a shill here, but if you value newspapers, if you value news organizations in this community, it helps to support them. I think there's benefit to that. I think, and there's a lot of studies that show that political polarization is less and government corruption actually happens less when you have a robust news source in your community. So I think we benefit from those things. I know it gets expensive and it's a difficult thing to squeeze into the budget sometimes, but the advertising versus subscription dynamic is changing pretty quickly. And I think a lot of places are realizing that if there's going to be a future, it has to happen with people supporting the things they care about. So that's probably how I land there. I'll stop talking now. Happy to hang out for a little bit if people have other questions, or I'm at bengessling@gmail.com if you have other ones that come up. Happy to chat if people have other things after this, but I'll pass the mic, as it were, to Kaylin to close us out.
Thanks, Ben.